So we'll see if we can work on that there. We are so glad to have everybody today. This is our second of 5 coastal resilience webinars. Today, we're talking about developing scenario-based plans to help manage risk. My name is Leah Dumichel, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Michigan Association of Planning and also the Michigan Coastal Management Program of the Department of the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, affectionately known as EAGLE. All of the webinars in this series will be recorded. So this one will join our last webinar. That one was on messaging for resilience, and that is over at the Michigan Association of Planning's website. And you can get to it from the link that's right here on your screen, or we'll put the direct link in the chat also. Also available from that page is a really wonderful collection of coastal resources, including planning guides and the Michigan Coastal Management Program's really excellent 6-video series on the science of the Great Lakes shoreline. So if that interests you at all, we really could not recommend that highly enough. With me here today is my colleague, Wendy Ramson, who will be moderating our discussion later. We really want your questions for a rousing chat during the sharing portion, so please do have them ready. Feel free to put them in the chat anytime, and we'll pick them up and ask them to our guests at the end of the program there. And then with that, I would like to introduce you to our illustrious guest today. Professor Richard Norton, JD, PhD, is a friend of Michigan coasts and of planning. He teaches and researches planning law, sustainable development, land use, and environmental planning at the University of Michigan, and he has aimed a lot of this really great work at the Great Lakes coasts. His legal background makes him uniquely suited to help us understand how we can use regulation to protect our state's most prized feature, and probably your state's most prized feature is your coastline also. After Professor Norton teaches us about scenario planning, he'll be joined by Amanda Oparka, Senior Environmental Planner at Macomb County, who will share her experience in using the scenario planning techniques along the Lake St. Clair shoreline. We've heard, as we have been working on these resiliency webinars and coastal leadership academies before it, that really these examples are often the most illuminating parts of coastal education. It's one thing to know what you can do and another thing to know how it actually went. So learning from each other about what actually happens is an important part of what we're trying to do here. We're really looking forward to a lively discussion afterward about how these ideas and techniques play out in the real world. And so again, be sure and bring us your questions. So welcome again to everybody. We're so glad to have you, and welcome to you, Professor Norton. Please do take it away.
All right, we'll see if I can make this work. Can you see that? It's working? Okay, good. Hello, everyone. I can't, the problem with Zooms is I can't really see anybody, so I'm just hoping that I'm connecting with you all. As Leah said, I've been doing a lot of work for a long time on our Great Lakes coastal shorelines, most of that work in Michigan. So I'll give a little bit of a background of the Great Lakes in particular and what makes them especially challenging to manage. But the methods that I'm presenting today actually travel quite well to other coastal settings and even riverine settings. They're quite adaptable. So hopefully they'll be useful to folks even from North Dakota. I saw there was a fellow there. So just to start off, this is all in the context of needing to plan for climate change and or climate weirding, or whatever term you want to use. The fact that we're starting to see more frequent and more intense storm events that are leading, particularly in coastal settings, to a lot of damage to shoreline resources. So that's the starting point. And we're also dealing with people wanting to build in maybe perhaps not the safest places. So to give a little bit of background, these are hydrographs showing the standing water levels of our Great Lakes extending from about 1918 until 2020. You can see from this right away, they're very highly variable. So the water levels change over the course of decades. They actually fluctuate seasonally over the course of a year, over the course of decades, and then through these multi-decadal cycles. And one thing to note right away is most of that variation is natural. When I'm out speaking, I often hear residents and local officials say, why don't we do a better job of controlling them to settle them down? And the reality is, I hear from the coastal engineers that it's just not possible. The water bodies are so large and the dynamics are so intensive that there's very little ability to control those water levels in any meaningful way. To set some background, we had an unusually long period of very low water extending from about 2000 until 2013. And in fact, we hit an all-time low in 2013, and then very quickly saw water levels climb up to peaking at all-time highs by about 2020. They've since dropped back a bit. They're still above the long-term average, but they're still relatively high. The thing we're hearing from the coastal climate scientists is, given climate change, we're probably going to see the frequency of the changes occur more frequently, and the amplitude get bigger. So we're going to be experiencing higher highs when they're high and lower lows when they're low. Those are the best predictions. Nobody can really gauge too far out in advance what the lakes are going to do. There was some talk for a while that the lakes were probably going to drop over the long term, but that now the best knowledge is that won't happen. We'll just see lots of more intensive variation. Another thing to know about our Great Lakes is, for most of them, the shoreline is actually receding over the long term. What makes it particularly difficult to manage in the Great Lakes settings is that it's not a continually progressive movement, it's a dance. The lakes, when they come up, they chew very aggressively away at the shoreline for a period of times, and then when the lakes go down, the shoreline recovers for a bit, and then they come back up, and then they drop. And so there is, over the long term, a progression of the shoreline landward. So we're experiencing shoreline movement landward over time in the Great Lakes because of erosion, much like the ocean coastal states are experiencing shoreline movement landward because of sea level rise. So we're not affected by sea level rise, but we're having much of the same effect. But it's a dance in Michigan and the other Great Lakes states because of the variation. Just to illustrate this a little bit, this is a beach in Ludington, which is about halfway up on the shore of Lake Michigan. That's what the beach looked like not long after the last long period of high. And you can see the beach is really scoured away and very flat. Just another image of that. And look at that house closely. Here's what it looked like a couple decades later after that long period of low water levels. So what happens when the lakes go down, if there's plenty of sand supply left, the lakes push that sand back up onto the beach. So all of the armoring that was up has been covered, and the house has a lot of beach in front of it. But when the lakes came back up, all of that sand was very quickly washed away again, and now the house is at risk. Here's another stretch. This is near the Michigan-Indiana border. It's in Michiana. This is a picture, again, shortly after the last long-term high, about 2000. And you can see the road commission. There's a road just up above that crest. The road commission was throwing boulders down there to try and stop that progression. Take a close look at that pipe that's sticking out of the beach or out of the shore there, and how high it is and far out it's extending. This is what that same beach looked like again after that long period of low water levels and lots of sand getting pushed up onto the beach. And you can see that pipe that used to be sticking way out is now almost entirely covered. Well, yet again, by the time the lakes came back up, very quickly chewed away. Somebody's built a house right above where those earlier pictures were taken, and they put down some rubble, and it's already starting to erode away. That's what the house looks like from an aerial view. And then by 2020, that all-time high, they're already having to do serious armoring to protect that house that was built right next to the water's edge. So there are major erosional problems going on in the Great Lakes. Here's where I want to point out that hardened shoreline armoring is not a good solution. And this is true on ocean coasts as well as our Great Lakes coast because of the dynamics. And basically, I hope that you can see the little arrow I'm using to point out. One of the problems when you build a seawall is you're accelerating erosion on neighboring processes. The wave energy goes somewhere and it gets dissipated. So you're doing damage to neighboring properties when you put that in. Another thing to point out on the image below that, it's a little bit faint, but you should see there's a sandbar off the shelf of the shoreline there. And if you look carefully, part of that shoreline to the south has been heavily armored, and the sand is getting pushed further and further out into the lake. And where there's still a natural beach, the sandbars residing pretty close to the natural beach. And what we're learning, what the geomorphologists are really demonstrating now is if you armor a shoreline, the wave energies are so intense, they push the sandbars further and further out into the lake. And ultimately, they push them so far out that the sand can't be recovered. When the lakes go back down, there's not enough sand in the nearshore system to push it back up onto the beach. So there's growing concern that the more you armor, the more you dissipate your sand supply, and you've blocked up the erosional processes that normally replenish that supply. You won't get a natural beach left. So those images to the left highlight that. And then this final image is a series of groins. These are actually in Wisconsin, again on Lake Michigan on the western shores there. And the problem that you have with putting in groins is you're basically taking the sand that would normally go downdrift and grabbing it and stealing or robbing that sand source from the downstream sources. So you can barely see on the edge of that photograph where that last groin was put in. The shoreline, the bluffs have started to increase in their failure rate. So there's a long array of groins that are sticking out into Lake Michigan and Wisconsin that have caused a whole lot of damage. Because of that, the state of Michigan doesn't allow the placement of groin fields anymore. Okay, so just another image to show that over the long term, shoreline armoring fails. I like to say the day you put a seawall in on Lake Michigan or near the large lakes or the ocean coast is the day the lake starts to take them back out. So now with Google Earth, you can go up and down the lakes and see evidence of failed shorelines in the past. The response is to build bigger, more robust shorelines, and they maybe will last a little bit longer, but they will almost certainly fail eventually as the lake works to take them out. And in the meantime, you've lost the natural beach out in front of those heavily armored shores. So that's a big concern, that a lot of our shorelines are now starting to get armored as people are trying to protect their homes, and that's coming at the expense of shorelines. And then when they ultimately do fail, you end up with a lot of rubble and debris out in the lake. People spend a lot of money to put the seawalls in. They're not very good about taking them out when they fail. And so that's creating safety and navigational problems. I want to point out too that that's basically an example of a natural living shoreline, not installed. It's just part of the system. And natural shorelines on high energy shorefronts will ultimately fail too. The lakes are just so powerful in their force working on the shoreline. Okay, this is to shift grounds a little bit. So what do we do about it? One of the challenges is that planning and zoning authorities have been played out to local levels of government for lots of good reasons, to provide local control. But that means we have lots and lots of local governments, particularly in the Great Lakes. We're a township state. So we have almost 300 units of local government that touch one of our Great Lakes in Michigan. And for the most part, they're not talking to each other or not collaborating together. So it's a pretty highly fragmented system. And there are a lot of communities that have very limited capacity. The smaller rural townships especially just don't have much in the way of planning staff, which creates a huge challenge. So the state of Michigan, with some funding from NOAA, engaged a research team that I led up out of the University of Michigan, but we also collaborated with the Great Lakes Research Center up at Michigan Tech and the Sea Grant program and a nonprofit planning firm called LEA to try and work collaboratively with communities to come up with methods that could be readily deployed at the local level to better plan for, to anticipate and plan for these highly dynamic settings, and particularly in the sense in the facing climate change and all of the uncertainty that that's bringing. So we worked really closely with the cities of Ludington and a little bit with St. Joseph to develop the methods that I'm going to show today. And then we worked very closely with Grand Haven City and Grand Haven Charter Township to deploy them, to kind of practice them out and try them out in practice with those communities. So what are we doing here? We're trying to respond to both shocks and stresses. Becoming a more resilient coastal community means figuring out how to respond to the shocks that happen when these massive storms come in and hit and do lots of damage. But we also need to be thinking about the long-term stresses that these coastal dynamics are creating, which in a coastal setting like Michigan is the long-term shoreline recession that's occurring, but also we have stretches of beach that are really massive sand dunes, and the sand dunes move. People may not realize it, but they're dynamic systems too, and so you can end up with houses that are going to be consumed by large clumps of sand. This picture, by the way, up in the right, is a picture of Houghton up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. A few years back, it was the Father's Day storm, I think, which was billed as the second 500-year storm event that occurred within about a 2-month period. So 500-year storms are not 500-year storms anymore. They're happening with greater frequency. Okay, so what are we dealing with then for planning purposes, evaluation planning purposes? We're trying to figure out how to combine both the ongoing fluctuations in water levels with the increasing storminess that's happening. There are 3 basic approaches communities can take, particularly for coastal hazards and especially for shoreline erosion. One, as I've already talked about, is to armor the shore. The second is to find a sand source and to nourish it by pumping sand back up onto the beach. And the third is to finally say, maybe it makes sense to actually pick up homes and move them back from the shoreline out of harm's way. And I'll just quickly step through this. The pros of armoring are that you can slow down erosional processes, and in the meantime, safeguard buildings and private property. The cons are it's incredibly expensive to armor. That little house probably spent more on that armoring project than the owner did on the house itself. I'm guessing, but the armoring is incredibly expensive. It degrades the shoreline, natural shoreline over the long term, and you lose public trust resources by installing them. Nourishing can slow down erosional processes and maybe safeguard buildings. It may be less damaging depending on where you draw your sand source from and where you put it, what's on the beach, but it's a short-term benefit. It can be very expensive to pump sand up on the beach, and you might not have a sand source. And then beyond that, I've heard engineers say that nourishing a beach is akin to throwing $100 bills out on the beach. They could wash away with the next storm event. So it's not really a long-term solution. Then the final larger approach is to relocate, to pick up and move structures away. The benefits of that are it's the most conservative in terms of preserving and conserving and stewarding ecological systems and natural beaches and maintaining the public trust. It's probably the most cost-effective over the long term, because now you've moved structures away from the beach, so you're letting the natural dynamics play out. You're not constantly fighting the beach and having to maintain and adapt and build bigger seawalls. The downside is you're removing structures. It can be expensive in the short term, and ultimately it means that you have to accept that you're losing private shoreline to the lake, and those are really bitter pills to swallow. So one key point to take away here is there's no perfect win-win solution in a lot of stretches of coastal shoreline. The dynamics are just such that it's a remorseless force set against really powerful desires to live and build right next to the shoreline. And especially once you've built, it's really hard to figure out how to get out of that without somebody having to pay some costs. So given those dire consequences and given the uncertainty that we're dealing with, how can we at least make a better stab at planning ahead to see what's coming and to account for that? And so what I'm presenting here is decision-centered scenario-based planning. So it's a form of scenario-based planning that's looking expressly at what are the different options that communities might employ to respond, and how can we evaluate the potential trade-offs and outcomes that would come from that work. So what we're going to do is combine what we called climate futures, working with the communities that we developed this with, combine those with management options to create a number of scenarios, and then within those scenarios, to analyze potential outcomes. So I'm going to step through this now, piece by piece. So the idea here is to account explicitly for uncertainty in the analysis. The old-fashioned way of planning was to plan and predict and plan. Well, we know we're going this way and we need to do this and that. And so here are the planning options, and this is the best option, and you should do this moving ahead. The problem with climate change and the kind of dynamics we're dealing with is we don't really know for sure when the next big storm is going to hit and how much damage it's going to do, and then how long of a period we're going to have below lake water levels. There's a whole lot of uncertainty. And even if the big storm hits, it might go hit down there, but not to the north. And so how do you deal with that? So we're planning for uncertainty. We also really set out to try and use off-the-shelf data and basic techniques, things that a community with a planning staff should theoretically be able to pick up and work with. We really endeavored to make it as simple conceptually as we could make it. So building in enough complexity to try and account for the complexities of the world, but keep it straightforward enough so that folks can grapple with what's going on here and make sense of it and do something with it. And then finally, to try and get planners away from saying, this is what you should do, to helping local residents and city officials, other officials in the community become the decision makers and buy into the decision that they're working with by being as informed as they possibly can. So we're starting off with the climate futures, and the ideal here is to identify your high hazard areas under these different futures. So again, what we're varying are the levels of standing water levels where they are and the degree of storminess that we're experiencing. None of these climate futures are strict predictions. They're possibilities that kind of run the gamut from the worst case to the best case. And so what we came up with was a lucky climate future where the water levels are at their long-term lows and the storminess isn't so great. An expected future where the water levels are somewhere around their long-term average levels. And maybe now we're dealing with a 100-year storm event that's happening within a 20-year planning horizon, or a perfect storm where the water levels are close to their all-time high. And now we're getting 500-year storm events, and it's all building on top of each other. We're deriving these from basic FEMA firms, flood information rate maps, and coastal inundation areas that are mapped by FEMA, and then some researcher-derived estimates. So in the guidance materials I'll show you a little bit later, our coastal geomorphologists identified potential wave run-up areas along Great Lakes coast that we fold into the modeling. And then we're also figuring out our coastal inundation areas using some data that were developed by the Great Lakes, from Michigan Tech's Great Lakes Research Center, and basic DEMs, digital elevation models that are available from the USGS. So now when you start to map this out, here's Grand Haven City showing a lucky climate future flood area, which is basically not much. There's a little bit of flooding going on the shoreline. Interestingly, they've already got some structures in that area, which theoretically shouldn't be happening because of the FEMA regulations. But now if we add in an expected storm where the lake levels are a little bit higher and the flooding is a little bit more intense, now we're starting to see some potential damage and loss of structures. And then for Grand Haven, it turns out the shorelines climb pretty quickly because of the topography. So there's definitely some extra flooding that could happen in a perfect storm event, but not too much substantially more than what you would expect for an expected storm. And I wanted to point out here, we've done this kind of same mapping in other stretches around the lakes for other communities that we've worked with. And Leah did a bunch for up in the northwest part of the lower peninsula. And you see pretty much the same pattern. The lucky flooding is right along the shoreline. You would expect to see more structures at risk during an expected storm climate future. And then in some places, some pretty extensive additional damage that might happen with an extreme storm event. What I've heard from communities that have been applying this following up, and maybe Amanda will speak to this with her experiences, is that these climate futures might not actually be dire enough, that the perfect storm might actually be worse than what we've been modeling. So communities will want to take a close look at what makes sense for them in terms of what they're likely to experience. So that gives us the hazard areas that we're worried about. Now let's connect in the decision-making possibilities that go along with that. So similarly, we identified three potential approaches to that: a current build-out modeling scenario, or future, a zoning build-out with no best management practices, and then a zoning build-out with best management practices. So again, we're not making predictions here. We're laying out a range of possibilities. We're drawing from the community's own zoning regulations and their own policies. And we're focusing especially on allowable development that is close to or within these high-risk flood areas. And I just stated the current development just basically maps what's there now and creates a baseline. Then we looked at the current zoning build out. We looked at the zoning codes. We ground truthed them to make sure they were accurate and vetted them with the local officials to make sure that the way we're applying the policies were accurate and appropriate. And then we added some BMPs, and mainly the BMPs we used for this modeling exercise were setbacks, a little bit further setbacks away from the water's edge, and also a little bit more protection of wetlands than what currently occurs in the state of Michigan under state and local law. And we derived all of this using the community master plans, the zoning ordinances, the other ordinances, and best knowledge about spatial management. And then we used ArcGIS, an extension of that community viz software, to actually map out the build out. So again, here's the city of Grand Haven. The dark areas are the existing footprints of existing structures. Then we mapped out, here's the current zoning. If they fully built out according to the current zoning, you can see there's substantial development that could still take place within the city. And then we mapped out the BMPs. And let me just toggle a little bit. You'll see it's not that much different. The key difference is under the setbacks, there are areas where you wouldn't see so much developing happening within these high-risk areas. So one of the messages we made to the community is nobody is telling the community that you have to stop growing or you have to stop developing. We're just pointing out that maybe you would be better off if you didn't allow development to take place in these most risky of places. Okay, now that we have the high hazard areas and we've got the mapped out areas, that gives us 9 different scenarios that combine these different management options with different climate futures. And for each of those scenarios, then we conducted a bunch of analyses to get a better sense of what are the trade-offs that the community is facing. So we looked at land use, how many structures might be at risk, particularly critical facilities or acreage. We did some fiscal analysis. What are the potential trade-offs in terms of damage that could occur under these different scenarios? And we also evaluated some environmental and social well-being measures that could be affected, plus some pretty extensive vulnerability assessments. I won't talk too much about those or the environmental assessments today, but I want to show you some of the outcomes in terms of land use. So this is for the city of Grand Haven. You can see under the current build-out option and looking at a potential perfect storm climate future, they've already got 256 structures at risk, or at least they did when we did this work a few years back. If they built out fully, according to their current zoning scheme, that could almost double. But if they adopted some basic BMPs, they're still going to see some additional structures at risk, but not nearly as much as what they might get without the best management practices. Here's now, I want to look at Grand Haven Township. I think part of my screen is obscured by the instructions, but there were 119 structures currently at risk. The township is bigger in terms of area, but it's not nearly as developed. So fewer numbers of structures at risk. Again, that would more than double under the current build-out zoning scheme, but you could greatly moderate the potential damage by adopting some best management practices. This is now some fiscal analysis that we did. This is looking at Grand Haven Township. The first thing to note is everybody thinks that our huge part of our tax base is along the shoreline. We can't deal with that. In fact, for the township, a very small portion of their tax base was actually potentially at risk in a perfect storm. So keep that in mind. And what we found using some software that FEMA's developed, Hazmat, I can't remember the name of it now, calculating all of the different potential damage costs that might occur if there were a perfect storm under the current build-out patterns. There's up to potentially $53 million of damage that Grand Haven Township might incur. If they fully build out according to their corridor zoning, that's almost 4 times as much damage that it could occur. And again, you could substantially mitigate that with the adoption of best management practices. So the scheme that we're seeing here is there's no way to avoid risk. When you live in the world, you're going to face some risk. So you're always taking on some risk with the decisions you make, but pretty consistently what we find when we work with different communities is they're not paying attention to these hazards. And so they've zoned and planned for build out that's going to put a whole lot of risk, a whole lot more property and built structures at risk. And if they do some basic BMPs, they're still going to encourage or encounter some risk, but it could be greatly moderated or tempered. So that's probably the big story to take from this planning endeavor. Just to kind of close the loop then, once you've done the planning, now you've got the groundwork to maybe think about what do we do following on. And the first good thing to be thinking about are figuring out where and how to adopt low impact infrastructure development. So green infrastructure, swales, try and keep your stormwater on site to at least minimize exacerbating the damage that could happen during storms. And then maybe the painful question is to maybe start thinking about setbacks from the water's edge, and possibly moving structures back. And if you noticed in my imagery earlier on, when I was talking about moving structures, I don't know if you can see it again, in the bottom part of this image, there's a house sticking out beyond the setback. There's a whole story that I can talk about how this ended up happening. This is St. Joseph, Michigan. But the folks who were in front of that, or lakeward of that setback, ended up having to pick their house up and move it back when the lakes came back up after that period of long-term low. So it is possible to adopt setbacks and enforce them and actually get people to move property back. The other thing St. Joseph did with their ordinance was make it clear they're going to revisit it periodically in case they have to change it based on changing shoreline dynamics. So that's another important piece to keep in mind. This is some additional work that the city of Grand Haven did to map a potential setback after we helped them with their planning efforts. And they did actually adopt a setback, and like St. Joseph, they made it clear they plan to revisit that setback periodically to make sure it works. So for the communities that we worked with, St. Joseph itself had already adopted a science-based and dynamic shoreline setback. Grand Haven City did the same thing after working with us. Grand Haven Township got all queued up to do that. And then at the end of the day, they couldn't get over the political hump of wanting to regulate private property owners. So they ended up not doing anything in terms of a regulatory approach. And then I'll just mention there's another township we worked with subsequently to this, south of St. Joseph, Chickaming Township. You can see it on the map at the bottom there. They are the only township that I know of that's actually adopted a flat out prohibition on installing permanent shoreline armoring. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but essentially it boiled down to they're very much a tourist community. They've got a long stretch of shoreline that has not yet been hardened. And their reasoning was, who's going to want to come in and visit our community and enjoy a beach community if there's no beach to go and enjoy? So they found the political will to prohibit hardened armoring, and we'll see if they can stick with it once they actually have structures that are at risk if the lakes move. This is the house I just mentioned in St. Joseph that got picked up and moved. It is technically feasible to pick up even sizable structures and back. It's not cheap, but in fact, it may be about the same cost as armoring the shorefront in front of it. It all depends on the setting and the opportunities for movement and such, but it's definitely a feasible option. This is just to show you that after the city of Grand Haven adopted their setbacks, the water levels came back, and they had a lot of property owners ask for variances to let them put in some temporary arming structures, and the city ended up letting them do that. So even once you've done the planning and set regulations, the political will to really enforce them can be a huge challenge. But what the city's hoping for, I got these slides from a fellow who was a city manager at the time, is it's better maybe to allow some temporary structures that can be taken out when the lakes go back down than to try and put in permanent armoring that basically just destroys the beach. That's the setup. So here's some lessons that we learned from this scenario-based planning approach. Despite our best efforts, it's still pretty resource intensive. This is just a complicated system. It's a complicated set of dynamics. It takes a lot of education to get people up to speed, and it takes some heavy duty analysis. So there's just no simple way to plan for these kinds of dynamic settings in the black box without really having some resources to support that. And that requires, you need to have some GIS expertise or access to folks who have that, and folks who have an understanding of shoreline dynamics and the legal and planning system that they're taking. It really requires having committed and entrepreneurial leadership to take this planning effort and move it forward and do something with it. It seemed to us that when we worked closely with these local officials and let the local officials themselves deliberate and kind of chew on the analyses, that they pretty much accepted the analyses as being accurate portrayals of what could happen and what the trade-offs would be. But at the end of the day, that may still not be enough to help them get over the political will that they need to garner to try and act, or to at least maybe do something that's a bit more ecologically friendly along the shorefront. The stance we've always taken, and I'll continue to say here, is you can do these planning exercises, you can provide these resources. At the end of the day, it's the local community that's going to have to decide which trade-offs do they find acceptable and what are they willing to do. And if they decide we're just not willing to take the loss of private property or the structures that are there, that's their decision, so long as they recognize the losses they'll incur in terms of the lost beaches and other natural resources. That's where the decision-making really kind of hits the road. So some final thoughts here, and I'll wrap up, and I'm running out of time, but I think everybody needs to recognize there's a new normal happening because of climate change. The dynamics that we dealt with before are not the dynamics that we're going to be dealing with going forward, and we have to recognize that. There are a lot of burdens that we're facing, cognitive disconnects. I think a lot of folks on the Great Lakes shorelines understood that the lakes go up and down and they're highly dynamic, and they maybe even understood there were places that were suffering from erosion. But a lot of people don't put that two and two together to realize that means the shoreline's moving landward over time. And that's a pretty much remorseless, unstoppable process. So even though we kind of have the pieces, it's still kind of difficult to put them all together to kind of realize, oh, here's what we're facing. And that's complicated because of 1,000 cuts. Nobody goes out and armors miles long areas of structures of shoreline. They're happening property by property. And before you know it, miles and miles of shoreline have been armored, but it was all through these individual decisions. So that's a function of kind of the fragmented decision-making system that we're in. And then if you listen to worries about boiling frog or sustainability for any time, this is the metaphor people love to use, that supposedly, I don't know if this is really true, if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it knows right away that it's boiling. But if you put a frog in a pot of cold water and slowly bring it to a boil, apparently the frog just doesn't recognize the changing temperature. The concern is with climate change, we don't see what's happening, it's happening too gradually. Maybe that's changing because we're starting to see such extreme storms and changing things. I worry personally that the political polarization that we're experiencing in this country broadly is only making it harder for us to come together and deal with these really difficult issues. So we've got to figure out how to learn to talk to each other again and get over the political polarization if we have any hope of productively addressing these difficult issues. I want to point out, we can't look for one-size-fits-all silver bullets that are landscape dumb. And one thing I'm hearing constantly is maybe we should be putting in natural living shorelines on the Great Lakes. That's a better alternative to hardened shoreline armoring or just to not doing anything. And they may work to some extent, but for the most part, the high energy Great Lakes systems are so high energy that even living shorelines are eventually going to erode away. So there is no silver bullet solution in a lot of these settings that's going to can satisfy everybody. I worry about our underinvestment in government. We really need government to be able to do good analyses and help inform the decisions we're making, but we're not paying for it through our willingness to be taxed. So that's another large global issue to think about. We've made some policies that have created unfortunate expectations. It's really hard to tell a property owner that you've given a permit to build and to put in a seawall that maybe in retrospect would be better to take that seawall out and move them home. So there have been past policy decisions that have put us into a pickle. And then finally, to recognize people, they may recognize at kind of a rational level that it just doesn't make sense to build a house right next to a shoreline that's eroding. But once we have that, it's so hard to give it up. And that's just a human trait that is makes it very challenging to deal with these very difficult situations. So where do we go from here? What do we do given all of that? Well, if you're a planner, think about engendering participation before the next crisis hits, before the water levels come up, get everybody educated, get them involved in conversations early, not when the crisis is hit, because once the crisis is there, nobody wants to talk. It's the smart thing to do. Everybody wants to get back to normal and kind of recover from the storm. Let's focus on getting good governance and good government. Tax us, please. Let's give more resources to local government so they can do the kinds of analyses that need to be done. Let's look for landscape smart policies. Let's look for no regrets policies. There's a great cartoon out there in the world. What happens if we do all of these things that are making our community better and it turns out climate change doesn't really happen? Well, we're still better. These are policies that made us all better off. So look for those. Learn to live with nature. Maybe we need to recalculate our expectations about what it means to live in highly dynamic settings. And then maybe let's start cultivating a notion of stewardship economics like Chickaming Township. If we're a coastal community that's utterly dependent on the natural resource base as the goose that's laying the golden egg, let's protect the golden egg. Let's make sure we're protecting those natural resources that really are the source of our economic welfare at the end of the day. Here, this slide is just, this slide is just to show you the links you can go to. There are gobs and gobs of resources out there now. The Resilient Great Lakes Coast is the website that we developed that presents in greater detail all of the methods that I just laid out here. And then some follow on. The Michigan Coastal Management Program has a great website with lots of resources and the videos that Wendy mentioned or Leah mentioned up front. So lots and lots of resources that you can draw from to move this forward. And then I'll stop right there and take any questions, or maybe I'll wait, not questions yet. We'll wait for Leah or Amanda to talk next.
I think, Dick, there are a couple questions, and then Amanda, if you hold on a second, I think we can take those now. And the first one was about the models. Where are you getting the GIS models from? Are these existing and publicly available or done specifically for the project?
Yeah, all of the modeling we did was using existing data. So we didn't go out and do any original field work. So for the management options, we got the parcel maps and such from the communities that we were working with. That was, or the counties that have the GIS layers. And then for the natural features, we pulled digital elevation models from the USGS, publishes those, and various sources. The state of Michigan has GIS layers. Sometimes we got them from the counties. And then the FEMA maps, the FEMA floodplain maps. So all of the GIS modeling, we tried to use existing data, and we had to augment them a little bit, particularly for the wave run-up estimates. The estimates that we used for Michigan are available on the website, the Resilient Great Lakes Coast website. You may need to do a little of your own original modeling depending on the features that you're dealing with. But for the most part, we're using existing data.
Yeah, and I think Amanda is going to talk a little bit about that and her experience, but I see here we have a comment from Evan, who's with the Western UP Planning and Development Region, working with Michigan Tech to do mapping-based project and tools for coastal and flooding resiliency. So for those in the UP area, the Western UP, then Evan's put a link here for you.
And there is a great, Michigan Tech has a great tool called the Shoreline Viewer, where they've mapped in greater detail the shoreline erosion rates and bluff movement rates, and there's a lot of good information there that you can pull into your modeling too.
Yeah, some compelling oblique photographs that help people understand how the shoreline changes over time. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think that has been helpful to some communities. We also have a question here.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I
was going to say, use Google Maps too. It's amazing now what you can see. Google Earth has historical data embedded for a lot of places. So you can just quickly create a historical progression of your shoreline using the Google resources that are publicly available. So take advantage of those resources as well.
Another question, are you assuming that BMPs from build out don't impact the existing structures in any positive way?
I'm not sure I'm following the question. There were definitely if you add in BMPs, which are setbacks, you end up with structures often that are already now within the setbacks you've established. So now you need to think through, if you're going to adopt a zoning code, have you just created non-conforming uses? Probably. And then you need to think through the implications of that. So if there are different strategies, folks are trying to think through, what does that mean? It could mean that if it's a non-conforming structure, you allow them to maintain it even if a storm comes along. If you go that route, you're probably heading towards armoring, because that's really the only solution. If you decide you really don't want to armor and you've got a non-conforming structure, you might have to create, as through your zoning ordinance, the requirement that you can stay there as long as your structure is safe. But as soon as it becomes sufficiently damaged by a storm event, that's the time now you have to finish, pick it up and pull it out, which now means you're accepting the shoreline's moving. You're letting people live there as long as there's shoreline there, but you're also creating a mechanism to have them relocate when the time comes. Neither of those are easy decisions to make, but that ends up, at least now you've framed out what are the range of options, decisions you have to make, and what are the trade-offs that you're confronting.
Yeah, I
Did
think,
that
Dick,
answer?
too, maybe this question also relates to folks who may be thinking more in the riverine situation. So the emphasis on green infrastructure, BMPs, in some ways, should those, if applied, help with the riverine flooding?
Yeah, so that's a really good, I want to point that out too. In these coastal settings and in riverine settings, there are two kind of hazards taking place. One is the movement of the shoreline landward, either because of recession or sea level rise if you're on an ocean coast, and that's a pretty remorseless process. If you're in a floodplain area where the risk is periodic inundation, now maybe you don't have to move out, but maybe you have to accommodate. Maybe you need to build up your structures, elevate them a little bit, get them out of the base flood elevation. Or the best, ideally, fix your setbacks and slowly over time acquire that property and turn it into a linear park that runs along the riverine setting. And now if it floods periodically, that's fine. That's what the park is designed to do. So this planning method might kind of help you target where are the places where over time you hope to acquire those properties and put them into a park system or something like that. But there, you don't have to, theoretically, if you're protective enough, that boundary shouldn't change over time. For a receding shoreline, one of the things you have to make clear in your zoning ordinance is that shoreline itself is moving. That means the setbacks are going to have to move over time as well. It's a dynamic system. So calibrating that, figuring out how often you have to adjust it, doing those kinds of steps are pretty challenging as well.
So last question before we turn it over to Amanda is from Rory, who's in Grand Haven Township, talking about the regulation standards at the state level versus local. And he asked, has the state worked to develop a generalized shoreline setback?
So the state has different setback rules in place. Part of it, they differ depending on whether you're in a state designated high-risk erosion zone, which fixes the setbacks and also maybe creates a situation where you have to build theoretically movable structures. But the way state law is currently written and the way this Eagle administers it through the permitting process, it doesn't actually cover much of the beach. They only regulate up to the ordinary high water mark. Anything landward of that really is left to the local government to be responsible for. And again, that ordinary high water mark is slowly moving over time, but it actually doesn't go that far up the beach. So it's entirely possible for someone to build a really large structure. The house that I showed in St. Joseph that got built too close to the shore was built in a period when the lakes were really low. And the city and the state, because of the way they operated their regulatory structure, couldn't tell the property owner, that's a bad thing to do, we're not going to let you build. They went ahead and built that property. That prompted the city to say, you know what, we need a setback, which was why they created the setback to put the house lakeward of the setback. And when they came in to get a permit to build an armoring structure to protect the house, the city said, no, you're going to do too much damage to everybody else. And we advised you not to do this in the first place. We're not going to give you a setback. And that's what prompted the property owner to have to pick up the house and move it back. So that's a kind of rambling answer to say the state there's a little bit going on here where the state's saying we only regulate a small part of the shoreline, the locals need to do it, but the locals say, well, we don't have, the state regulates it, they should be doing it. So there's a little bit of finger pointing going either way. I think there's a real need in the state of Michigan to have some serious conversations about how to better coordinate state and local planning and regulatory authorities to rationalize them better. They're not working very well right now, the way they're working.
Great. All right, so we are going to let Amanda Oparka now talk about the experience that she is having with this methodology in St. Clair Shores.
All right. Oh, hold on. Sorry, trying to share the screen here.
That's fine.
Where did it go? All right, can you see it?
Yep, you're there.
Okay. So thank you, Leah. As Leah mentioned, I'm with Macomb County, and we are currently working on a scenario planning project with two of our communities, actually, St. Clair Shores and the city of New Baltimore, with the Association of Floodplain Managers through the Great Lakes Resilience Challenge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going through right now and some issues that we've run into. I realize I should have included a reference slide for all the people that are not local here to Michigan. Macomb County is in southeast Michigan. We are on the shoreline or coastline of Lake St. Clair, which is a connecting water body between Lake Huron and Lake Erie. We're about 10 miles north of the city of Detroit, for reference. And one of the our biggest issue that we have here in Macomb County is that we have 51 miles of natural physical coastline, which has been augmented over the last century to be 160 miles of coastline actually that was created. And so this is all canals, waterfront living. I don't know if you guys can see where my mouse is, but this is a whole subdivision that was built on man-made canals. Here's another one. There's a bunch down here in the south in the city of St. Clair Shores. So we have been creating coastline. All of this all but 4 miles of this 160-mile coastline is privately owned and not publicly accessible. So we are dealing with a lot of hardened shoreline, a lot of seawall. And this is kind of an example of what we have. The picture on the right is actually a friend of mine. They just built a home and just had this new seawall installed. It's actually ocean grade seawall. The contractor told them that they won't have to replace it for 200 years. So, and you can also notice on top, they put a concrete walkway all around it. So there's no infiltration going on there. The picture on the left is a public park in Chesterfield Township that had a failing seawall. The township contacted our department and asked, what could we do about the seawall? They obviously couldn't afford to just pay to fix it. So they actually ended up doing a natural shoreline there, but I'll show that at the end. So we are working, like I said, on the scenario planning. One community that we're working with is the city of St. Clair Shores. And as Dick said in his presentation, some of these scenarios aren't dire enough. And this is a great example of where that's the case. Our original projections that they showed the perfect storm or the greatest impact was actually very similar to what we saw in the high water levels in 2020 and 2021. It showed the flooding, basically showed the flooding that occurred then. So we said, maybe we want to look at how it's a little bit more extreme because we don't want people to think, oh, it's never going to be any worse than it was in 2020. And in 2020 and 2021, we had historically high water levels. People were sandbagging their properties. And then the second the water came down, those homeowners got rid of their sandbags and went on their way. And it seems to be in this area that people, we had historically low water levels in 2013, then it came up to historically high, now they're back down, and it kind of seems like people out of sight, out of mind, forget how just as quickly as it happens, they kind of forget what it was like. So we wanted to come up with a way to show that, there is going to be an increase, or there could be an increase, that it's not just only going to be as bad as it was in 2020 and 2021. So then the people we were working with on this project, they went back and redid the scenarios, and then it was way too extreme. This was just an example. This is just a draft of one of them. And this was our likely or the lowest forecast, which is probably more closer to our perfect storm, or what we want to show. We do, this is an important highway here. There is flooding that occurs along there. But the perfect storm in this scenario was just showing the whole community as flooded. And, we want to make the impact with our decision makers, but we also don't want to scare them or get them so riled up that they don't want to make any changes, or, that they kind of write it off. So we are going through the process to see what makes sense for our communities, or this community. I just wanted to note that this is definitely not a one size fits all thing. You can't, someone had asked, where's the GIS model? I think it really has to be tailored to your community and what your decision makers are going to feel comfortable with. And one thing we're struggling with is because we have so much private land and not a lot of public shoreline. And, like Dick said, if you remove one seawall, what is the consequence on the properties next to it? And we can't just say, okay, no more seawalls, and then we are dealing with other erosion issues. So we're trying to come up with solutions that our communities can implement that makes sense for them. We're not there yet on this one, so maybe we'll have to do a follow-up of what we come up with for that. So that's where we're at on the scenario planning, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about our experience with it. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to get a product that really will help these communities change the way they plan. I was also asked to talk about the data collection. And like Dick said, a lot of this data is out there. It's just knowing who to ask or where to go for it. Here in Macomb County, we have our own GIS department that houses a lot of data for the entire county. We now have an open data portal that you can go online and download information from, layers from. One set of data that's pretty good is the Esri Living Atlas, which is free to anybody with a GIS license. So you just have to download it though, so you can use it on your system. The state of Michigan has an open data portal as well where you can get layers. NOAA has an open data portal. Like Dick said, historic aerials you can find on Google Maps. If you're in Southeast Michigan, Wayne State University has some very old historic aerials like 1949 that you can pull up for your communities. I know we talked about oblique photos. The Army Corps has some photos for our area that I think you could probably Google and find that they might have them for other coastal areas as well. And then here in Southeast Michigan, we have SEMCOG, which is our Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, and they also have quite a bit of data. They do LiDAR flights every 2 or 3 years for us. So I think just reaching out to those local agencies or even the state to see if that data is out there. USGS has some other data. And then, of course, the FEMA maps, which the FEMA maps are on the Esri Living Atlas. And I think a lot of the USGS data is also on there. And that's it. My last slide has my contact information. This picture here is a natural shoreline that was installed in Chesterfield Township. That was the first photo here on the left. That's what it looked like before. And now they have installed this natural shoreline. This part of it is armored with rocks. There's a spot where it's a natural planting with actually sand is starting to fill in there. And then they have these wave attenuation structures out here that provide fish habitat, but also block some of that wave energy. This was installed in the highest water levels. So that is accounted for here. This picture was probably taken about a year ago, and since then the water has come down quite a bit, but the project seems to still be holding up and functioning pretty well. And that's all I have.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I think people have been adding some resources to the chat, so please take a look. Great crowdsourcing that information. Now is a good time to start talking. The way we've structured the format of these webinars is that after presentations, we have time if people want to talk about their communities, share resources, figure out how to move forward. This is the time to do that. So you can certainly ask questions of our speakers, but also you may be able to just raise a topic that we can talk about. So let me put that out there. We have a question. What is the name of the thingies along the shoreline with the natural habitat for fish? Is that like a reef development? Anyone know?
Those are called, they call them wave attenuation structures. They're basically just giant piles of rocks that have little crevices that the fish can, lay their eggs in and stuff like that. And they protect that little like cove area from bigger waves. So wave attenuation structures, I believe, is what the like engineering term is for them.
Yeah, Wendy, can I jump in?
Yeah.
On that? Those were installed by the Great Lakes Commission, I believe. Yep. And talking with Eric, the fellow there who's doing that, he stressed to me that that may actually be a good outcome or a good technology to use in some places, but it's very site dependent. So I guess the message I want to convey is armoring may be appropriate in places that you may just decide there's just too much development here. We can't realistically pick up our seawalls and move back, which is, I think, what's happening for these communities on Lake St. Clair. And that's the decision the community makes. There may be places where living shorelines actually are feasible and will do the trick. And there may be places where these attenuation structures may work, but don't think that they're silver bullets and they're going to work everywhere all the time. It's all very, very site dependent. So reaching out to the COGs are starting to get into this realm of how do we think about those structures. There's a lot of research going on right now to look at the different impacts the structures have. The Great Lakes Commission has been focusing on that. That's a resource to think through. So definitely worth exploring. I also wanted to mention there may be places, St. Joseph, Michigan, does some beach nourishment. In fact, the picture I showed to illustrate beach nourishment was St. Joe. They benefit though because they're getting dredge fill from the river. The Corps comes in and dredges the river periodically. And they realized the sediments were clean enough to actually put on the beach instead of dumping them out in the lake. So there may be opportunities to look for, if dredging is already happening, to pick up those sand supplies. Beyond that, the state of Michigan has been very reluctant to permit dredging on Michigan shorelines because they're worried about habitat harms. Where you take the sand could really disrupt habitat, and how you dump it could have the same effect. So there's not much beach nourishment taking place in Michigan right now, given those constraints.
So I want to bring this back to scenario planning. I'm just curious if anyone in the audience has tried any of these techniques, maybe not specifically the methodology that Dick outlined, but have you tried these in any of your work? And if so, how did it go? And And yeah, if you want to, you can raise your hand or you can put something in chat. I know it's a little bit larger than we usually have, but we want to try to keep this as a discussion. So feel free to unmute yourself. Anybody? Just interesting. This is something that we hope through this webinar that gets out the word out there as a methodology that people can use as a learning opportunity within their community. Like Amanda has said, really just showing people without alarming them too much, I guess, that these are things that they should be looking at. Anyone? All right. Well, then this is a good webinar to get that started. Hopefully some of you take these ideas back to your community. Dick provided the link to, and I should mention that we will put this, both the slides and the video on our website so that you can go back and get these resources. Some of the resources that are here in the chat, I think, are really helpful. We have a number of GIS folks who are putting links up here to imagery and different data sets.
Can I ask a question of our speakers? So I heard Dick say, and I think, Amanda's in the process of that, this is not so much a matter of like, this is technical information, the planner's telling you what to do. Like, really, it has to be sort of digested by the decision makers. And I just wonder what that process looks like. Like, do you know for sure that there's one meeting where everybody leaves like, oh my God, kind of shell shocked, but then you come back a few weeks later and you have, another, like, what does that process look like where that information is onboarded by decision makers and magic is happening?
You want to answer that first, Amanda?
Well, we haven't gotten to that point yet. I can say though, I sit on the planning commission for my community, which is also one of our coastal communities, and I don't think it's just like a one meeting kind of thing. I think there is, and I know the city of St. Clair Shores, which we're working with right now, they're going through their master planning process, as is the community I live in. So these topics are being brought into the conversation: resiliency, climate change, changing rainfall predictions. This is, I think, the first time that these communities are really addressing them. And I think it helps that we just recently had that high water and that we still continue to experience quite a bit of flooding from large rain events. Some of these roadways get flooded every time there's a big rain event. And so I think it's fresh on people's mind, and I'm hoping that it's, maybe a series of 2 or 3 meetings that helps bring them along. But I don't think we're quite there at that process, like in that stage right now, but I think we're getting there.
Yeah, that's consistent with our experience with the communities that we worked with. There was never a single meeting where everything got laid out. It's just you really need to anticipate you're going to have multiple meetings, and there's going to be a lot of shell shock because these are really dynamic systems, and there are, in many cases, no really good happy outcomes. And the initial reaction a lot of folks have is, well, that can't possibly be true. So then you just put the data out on the table and you step back and you let them work it through. And I remember distinctly meetings, we'd present some information and step back, and folks would say, well, it'll never happen. And then someone else in the commission would say, well, yeah, kind of think about it. That actually happened here and that happened there. Or somebody would say, well, that's Joe's property. He's never going to develop there. Well, Joe could sell tomorrow. And right now, under your current zoning code, somebody could move in and build whatever they want. Oh yeah, we hadn't thought about that. So these planning methods are really designed to get people talking and understanding the futures they're facing and how the decisions they make could impact them, and get a better sense of the trade-offs that they're going to have to confront, just so at the very least the choices and decisions they're making are as well informed as they could be. And in some places they might decide we're going to go to protect the natural coast, and other places they may decide we don't want to tell our property owners they can't protect their homes. But at least hopefully they recognize the trade-offs again, that that they've taken on in making those decisions. And it's not going to happen in a single meeting. It's going to take multiple meetings and a lot of dialogue. And it's going to take re-education too. Most of the communities we worked with, a lot of the local officials I worked with have moved on to different places now. So there's a whole lot, it's just a continuous need for re-education and people staying up to speed.
So
Real
Whoever
quick,
thought-
Wendy,
Yep.
Liz is on the call. I was going to throw it over to Liz from St. Clair Shores because I think she might want to chime in on how her community, she's the planner for the city of St. Clair Shores. So Liz, I don't know if you want to chime in. I hate to put you on the spot, but.
No, not at all, Amanda. I appreciate that. So we have, as Amanda indicated, we're currently in the process of updating our master plan. We received a grant earlier this year from Eagle, I think, called a high water infrastructure grant, and that would is paying for part of our master plan update, and we need to include a resiliency plan within that. We're tying in the information that we are getting through the other grant that we're a part of that Amanda was talking about, and that a lot of the information Dick had presented earlier in 2023 to this group. We want to take all of that and include it in the resiliency plan. On a separate but related note, we had members of one of our homeowners association approach our members of our city council to create a waterfront setback ordinance. And we worked for several months with 3 council members and members of this homeowners association to create a waterfront setback ordinance. The ordinance was brought before the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission, and this goes back to the many meetings versus the one meeting idea, right? So one meeting in front of the Planning Commission basically sent it back to staff saying, we don't want to impose this on over 900 waterfront or canal front property owners unless we know they want it. So we basically may be sending out a survey to all 900 plus of our waterfront and canal front property owners to see if this is something that they want to have. Do they want to self-impose this? And then, we'll go from there. But I think that Amanda hit it on the head when she was talking about the different scenarios of how bad it looks in cases of high water. If we were to present to our appointed and elected officials some of these worst case scenarios, I think it would actually be disbelief. Like there's no way this could possibly be true and it could possibly be this bad. And we didn't want that shock and awe to deter the bigger picture of we need to do something. So the idea is that we're scaling back how bad it actually could look to something slightly more palatable so that we can at least get something in place that would be working towards a more resilient coastline.
Can I riff off of that too? The scenario that Liz just laid out is typical of a lot of places, and you definitely need to work with and understand the concerns of the shoreline property owners, but don't limit your conversation to just the shoreline property owners, because the whole community has a stake in this, especially if you're on a lake shoreline that still has lots of natural features. I'm pretty sure if you only ever engage shorefront property owners, you're probably going to see an armored shoreline eventually, because they're going to do everything they can to protect their property to the loss of the rest of the community. And if you engage the full community, maybe you'll end up there, but maybe we'll pull back and say, that's not the outcome that we want to see in the future. It's especially hard in places like Liz's community where it's already built out and there's so much investment. And if the flooding really is as bad as what's been predicted, everybody's at risk. How do you deal with that? But there are still long stretches of lake shoreline that haven't been heavily developed. And in those places in particular, that's you want to try and think ahead and really make sure everybody understands, again, the trade-offs that are being made in that context. I don't envy you, Amanda and Liz, for the challenges you confront in the planning and decisions that you need to make.
It's a delicate balance for sure.
So I just want to make sure we've been talking about a lot of resources. We have some that are on the MAPS website that's associated with the webinars. I put in the chat the Michigan Coastal Management Programs planning guide, which has some helpful, kind of a very general synopsis of some of the work that Dick has talked about, some of the science and some of the planning techniques. So if you're trying to get started in your community, that's a great place to start with that planning guide. I think also Tyler included the video that they have done, Michigan Sea Grant. So there's some resources there. In fact, probably there's a wealth of resources. I think we as a community working in this space are trying to figure out how to bring together so that they're not in 10 different places or 20 different places. But those are some places to start. I think there was a question that came up. If we're done with this most recent discussion about temporary mats that can be placed along the shoreline during times of high water levels and then removed. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I can offer, so I'm not a coastal geologist, but I've spent a lot of time collaborating with them. There are systems that are available that can temporarily provide some protection. A lot of folks are looking to, they're called geotextile tubes. One of the images I showed from Grand Haven were these, they're large, basically sandbags. And theoretically, you can put them in place in a temporary basis when the water levels are really high. So now I'm talking about high energy shorefront systems. And the thinking is you can put them in place when you need them, but as soon as the lakes go back down, you can tear them apart and dump the sand on the beach and go back to a natural state. And you've kind of gotten through that period of high water. The state of Michigan was starting to permit that, and they've already started to run into some bumps. There's some places where they used material that's not degradable. It's just a heavy duty canvas, and they buried them really deep in the shoreline. And basically what they've done is create a seawall out of sandbags instead of armoring. And so now there's some concern that you don't want to let temporary measures become permanent measures. If what you were trying to do is provide temporary relief, but biodegradable geotextile bags that provide temporary relief might be something to think about. You want to be sure you don't create expectations that that's just the first step toward permanent armoring if you're trying to stop permanent armoring. There are also things called HESCO systems. They're basically kind of temporary seawalls that are sandbags that are stacked on each other, and they use poles. My understanding is Eagle has decided to not permit them anymore because they're very concerned the structures that hold them together can become satellites. If during a storm, they can become dangerous implements that could hurt somebody. So you got to be careful with the structure that you're putting in place, that you haven't just created something that could be harmful if this right storm picks it up and moves it. The natural living shorelines often use coconut structures that are built out of coconut fibers and other things that will naturally degrade over time, and they can have some benefit. They're especially useful on the inland lakes that have some wave energy, but not enough to really be damaging. If you can put in those living shorelines and have the plants and those structures in place, so that really will arrest the erosional processes. So these are the lakes that are connected to the Great Lakes where the water levels come up and down, but there's not enough wind energy to really cause serious erosion. The trick there is you have to convince your shoreline property owners to let those natural plants grow. A lot of people want to have a sandy beach, or they want to mow those down so they can look out at the water. Well, you've just taken away the living part of the system that's actually providing the relief from erosion. So you have to kind of manage shorefront property owner expectations. All of that is now finally getting around. I've not heard of mats that you would place on the beach to try and stop erosion, but my guess is, especially on a high energy shorefront, they probably would just get torn apart if the right storm hits. The energy of the waves is just so tremendous. I don't imagine they would last very long.
So I mentioned Eagle resources. I put in the chat box the full page. We have been assisting MAP has been assisting the Coastal Management Program with the Coastal Leadership Academies. I know some of you on the call today are graduates of the first Coastal Leadership Academies. They are continuing with these. So if you think in your community that there is an appetite to look into this, but there hasn't been any movement so far, you may want to contact the Coastal Management Program to see if you can have a Coastal Leadership Academy come to your community. It goes through the science, some of the things that Dick talked about, the scenario-based planning. It talks about planning and zoning tools in a way that brings people together, hopefully, to think about actions that they could do. So not what, like, I think Liz and her colleagues were in one of our Coastal Leadership Academies, and they had already been thinking about some of these things, but it I hope just provided an opportunity for them to find out what their next steps would be. I think Emmett County as well, they've gone and done a lot of things since the original Coastal Leadership Academy. So keep that in the back of your mind for those Michigan communities that may not have addressed these issues yet, to think about that as a first step. Anything else? You all have been very attentive, but we don't want to end if there are still questions in the group or topics to be discussed. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you're able to join us for our next webinar, which will be on charrette planning. And if you give me just a moment, I will give you the link to an evaluation for today. If you could just take a few minutes and fill out this evaluation about this webinar, what worked, maybe what didn't work, any questions you still have, we'd appreciate that feedback. The next webinar is on December 14th. I think a number of you have already registered for that, but you know, we'd love to have you back if you are still interested in learning more about the engagement side of things. And I will put that link again in the chat for the webinar. Leah, anything else that you want to bring up?
No, I just want to say thank you. This is great. I learned something every time I hear from you folks. Today, it was loss aversion is greater than prudence. I think I will be thinking about that in many of these conversations to come. So just thank you. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day and go out and do some good planning.